For anyone looking to really grasp the depth of piano music, Beethoven's 32 sonatas are this incredible mountain range, a lifetime of exploration packed into one composer.
Hmm.
And we know you're not just here for the postcard view. You want to understand what makes this territory so significant, and you want to get there efficiently.
Absolutely. These sonatas aren't just beautiful sounds, they're a living document of Beethoven's evolving genius and the piano's own transformation.
Right.
What makes delving into them so rewarding and sometimes so intricate is the sheer wealth of historical material we have. His original handwritten scores, early printed versions, even notes from people who knew him.
Okay, let's unpack this. It sounds like a historian's dream, all these primary sources.
Mm.
So what's the catch? Why isn't it straightforward to just, look at these originals?
What's fascinating here and creates a real puzzle is that these fundamental sources often don't agree with each other. We find a surprisingly large number of variations. The notes themselves can be different, the rhythms, how the music is articulated with slurs and staccato, the expressive markings, even whether a section should be repeated or not.
Wow.
And as Beethoven's writing for the piano became more advanced, the pedal markings, which are crucial to the sound, well, they also show inconsistencies.
So it's not like we have one definitive blueprint, more like a collection of slightly different drafts.
Precisely.
Mm.
And for a long time, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, editors basically acted as final authorities. They'd decide what they thought was correct and publish that, often without even mentioning that there were other possibilities in the original sources.
Mm.
It was a very decisive approach.
I can see how that would simplify things for a performer back then. But it doesn't really give you insight into Beethoven's own process or what he might have originally intended, right?
Exactly. Then, in the mid-20th century, there was a real shift in thinking.
Uh,
The idea of trying to get as close as possible to what the composer originally envisioned gained momentum, fueled by the growth of musicology as a field of study.
okay.
Suddenly, being faithful to the composer's intent became a central goal. And fortunately, advances in technology made it much easier for scholars and performers to access and compare all these historical documents.
Ah, right.
So what we have is a move from editors making definitive choices to performers having the tools to explore the evidence themselves.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So now performers have all these potentially conflicting versions at their fingertips. How does that change how they approach these sonatas today?
This raises a really important question about the performer's role. Many musicians today feel a responsibility to investigate these original sources themselves.
Huh.
They want to see where the discrepancies are, examine them in detail, and then make their own informed choices about which version feels most musically convincing and historically grounded. It's a much more engaged and um, scholarly way of preparing a performance.
That sounds like a lot of detective work. So, who are some of these early editors who are grappling with these source issues, and what were their general approaches to this complex material?
Well, the early 20th century saw some very influential figures step into this role. Alfredo Casella, for example, created an edition in 1920 that was full of his own strong opinions and a lot of performance advice, even down to very specific suggestions for how to use the pedals.
Really specific, huh?
Yeah. Then you have Heinrich Schenker's edition from 1923, which is still highly respected for its deep analytical insights, although he was known to occasionally adjust small details like dynamics or articulation markings.
Mm.
So even these highly regarded scholars sometimes felt the need to, make their mark on the text.
So, even the experts weren't always just presenting a clean copy of the original?
It really highlights the inherent challenges of interpreting historical documents. Harold Craxton and Donald Francis Tovey's 1931 edition had a strong scholarly foundation. But they were also quite open about revising the music at times,
Mhm.
often discussing and sometimes disagreeing with what earlier editors had done.
Mm.
It was a very active engagement with the existing editions.
It sounds like there was a real conversation happening through these printed editions.
Absolutely. But perhaps the most discussed edition from this period is Arthur Schnabel's from 1935. He was a celebrated interpreter of Beethoven, and his musical ideas were deeply woven into his edition.
How so?
He printed Beethoven's original notes in a large font, and his own additions, performance suggestions, pedaling, even metronome markings that suggested tempo flexibility within movements in a smaller font.
Ah, okay.
He also included extensive footnotes explaining his reasoning.
Tempo changes within a single movement indicated in the score. That sounds like it could be quite a departure from a more traditional approach.
It certainly sparked a lot of debate. While some musicians greatly valued his insights as a performer, others found his edition too cluttered and felt it obscured Beethoven's original intentions.
I see.
The metronome markings, particularly the indications for internal tempo changes, were a major point of contention, with some arguing that they disrupted the structural coherence of the music.
Okay, so navigating these historical sources is clearly a complex task. Let's shift our focus to something very tangible, the actual notes Beethoven wrote. As we mentioned, the piano was evolving rapidly during his lifetime. How did the limitations of earlier instruments influence his compositional choices, and how do performers address those limitations today?
This is a really fascinating area where the historical context meets modern performance practice. Early pianos had a more limited keyboard range, typically around 5 octaves.
Right, 5 octaves.
As Beethoven's career progressed, his writing increasingly stretched beyond these limits. We see examples of this quite early on in the Waldstein Sonata, Opus 53, where the first movement reaches up to F sharp, G, G sharp, and A.
Wow, way up there.
Later, in Opus 31, number 3, we find G and A flat, and the Appassionata, Opus 57, goes even higher, reaching C, which was the highest note on the Erard piano he owned later in his life. So Beethoven was actively composing for the expanding capabilities of the instrument.
Wow, so those very high notes simply wouldn't have existed on some of the pianos Beethoven was familiar with earlier in his career. This creates a real question for performers today playing on modern pianos with a much wider range.
Exactly. This creates a real dilemma for editors and performers. When Beethoven wrote a note that was at the very top of the piano of his time, and we now have many notes above that, should we consider altering his writing?
What are the arguments on both sides of that question?
Well, those who argue against making any changes, including figures like Czerny and Schindler, who were actually Beethoven's students, emphasize that Beethoven's choices were made within the specific constraints of the instruments he had available. They suggest that his adaptation to those limits might have been a fundamental part of his creative process. There's even Beethoven's own statement that only he was qualified to transcribe his piano sonatas for other instruments.
Oh, interesting.
Which some interpret as implying a similar level of authorial control over any alterations to the original piano writing. It's about respecting the historical integrity of the work.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about honoring the specific decisions the composer made in his historical context.
On the other hand, those who advocate for making some adjustments argue that if Beethoven had had access to a piano with a broader range, he would have naturally utilized those higher notes.
Right, it makes sense too.
They point to his often visionary and almost orchestral conception of the piano, suggesting that making these small changes for today's instruments ultimately serves his broader aesthetic intentions. It's a question of whether to prioritize historical accuracy or the potential realization of the composer's imagined sound.
So it's a balance between historical fidelity and a kind of extrapolated intent.
Precisely. Interestingly, the trend in contemporary scholarly editions is towards being quite conservative, generally pointing out the original keyboard limitations, but not actually recommending any alterations to the notes themselves. 19th century editors, on the other hand, were often more inclined to make these kinds of changes, sometimes without even noting that they had done so.
Are there any specific instances where adjusting the notes to fit a modern keyboard is more or less commonly accepted by performers today?
Yes, there are a few examples that are often discussed. For instance, in the first movement of Opus 10, number 3, in measures 15 and 22, the left hand plays single notes on downbeats, where it strongly suggests Beethoven would have written octaves if the lower notes had been available in the pianos of his time.
Okay, so it feels incomplete almost.
Exactly. Many editors and performers feel comfortable adding those octaves today, as it seems to fulfill an implied harmonic richness. However, making more substantial rewrites is generally viewed with more caution. For example, altering measure 104 in the exposition of that same movement to perfectly mirror measure 285 in the recapitulation, which involves a more significant change to the melodic line, is usually considered less acceptable. It's a case-by-case consideration of the musical impact and the perceived intent.
It's a really nuanced approach, a sliding scale of intervention. Now, we can't talk about Beethoven and the piano without mentioning the famous Broadwood piano he received. Did that instrument, with its extended range, resolve some of these issues in his later works?
The Broadwood piano, which arrived in 1818, was indeed a significant instrument. It had a 6-octave range from C to C and a split damper pedal, allowing for more nuanced pedaling effects.
6 octaves, wow.
But there's a common misconception that the Hammerklavier Sonata Opus 106 was written specifically for this instrument because it was the next piano sonata he published.
Oh, really?
Yeah. However, Beethoven actually began working on that sonata in late 1817 before the Broadwood arrived. Furthermore, the term Hammerklavier itself simply meant fortepiano to Beethoven.
Just fortepiano.
Right. He even asked his publishers to use it as the German equivalent on all his works with German titles. So while the Broadwood undoubtedly influenced his later piano writing and the possibilities he explored, it wasn't the direct inspiration or intended instrument for Opus 106 in the way some believe.
Fascinating how the instruments themselves played a role in shaping the music. Let's move on to another crucial aspect of performance: ornamentation. Trills, turns, mordents. These little embellishments can really color the melodic line. How did their purpose and execution evolve during Beethoven's compositional period?
Ornamentation initially had a very practical function, largely to enhance the often weak sustaining power of earlier keyboard instruments. It helped to make the melodic line sing.
Right, keep the sound going.
Exactly. As the piano developed a fuller, more resonant sound, the role of ornamentation shifted, became less about simply sustaining a note and more about providing expressive extension and adding character to the melody, almost like a vocal flourish.
Ah, more expressive.
This change in function naturally led to changes in how these ornaments were performed. Composers, including Beethoven, started to rely less on the traditional symbols and increasingly wrote out the ornamentation in full, sometimes with very specific and quite elaborate figures that the standard symbols couldn't adequately represent.
So he spelled it out more.
Yeah. Even when the traditional symbols were used, the accepted ways of realizing them were in a state of flux.
So Beethoven was composing during a time of transition for ornamentation. That must create a lot of ambiguity for performers trying to understand his intentions?
It certainly does. When faced with these older traditions alongside the evolving 19th century practices, performers have to make several key decisions. Where should a trill start on the main note or the upper note? How should it end with or without those little trailing notes called afternotes? Where does a turn begin, and how is it placed rhythmically within the bar? And similarly, for mordents, do you start on the upper or main note and do you play it on or before the main beat?
It sounds like deciphering a musical code. Were there any definitive guides that Beethoven and his contemporaries would have consulted for how to execute these ornaments? C.P.E. Bach's treatise on keyboard playing comes to mind.
That's a very relevant connection. C.P.E. Bach's Essay on the True Art of Keyboard Playing was indeed a highly influential text, and Beethoven himself even recommended it to Czerny for his son's education.
Okay, so he knew it well.
However, it's impossible to know with certainty to what extent Beethoven strictly adhered to the ornamentation section of Bach's treatise when performing his own works. He might have valued it more as a foundation for understanding broader principles of musical taste and as a guide for improvisation,
Not necessarily a rule book.
rather than a rigid set of rules for every single ornament in his written scores.
That's a good point. Recommending a book doesn't necessarily mean you follow every single instruction within it.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that even in its own time, C.P.E. Bach's suggestions for realizing ornaments were considered by some to be relatively conservative. So, the idea that Beethoven consistently and rigorously followed this earlier performance practice is, at best, speculative. Adding another layer of complexity is the fact that the sonatas have been subject to countless editorial interpretations over the last 2 centuries.
Right.
Some of these interpretations have become deeply ingrained performance traditions, and they significantly influence what sounds right to modern listeners, regardless of their historical accuracy.
So performers today are often navigating a complex web of historical research, established performance traditions, and their own musical intuition.
Precisely. In many instances, there aren't clear-cut answers. Perhaps the best way to approach it is to think of realizing ornamentation. Like understanding a language, you need to know the grammar, the rules, and historical context, but how you speak, how you perform, depends on the specific situation and your own expressive choices.
Let's delve into some specific ornamentation challenges. Trills, for example, you mentioned the starting note is often debated. What are some of the complexities there in Beethoven's sonatas?
Throughout the sonatas, deciding whether a trill should begin on the main note or the upper auxiliary note is a frequent point of discussion. Even in the early Opus 2, No. 1 sonata, it appears that both approaches can be justifiable depending on the musical context.
Okay.
For instance, in the first movement, the trills in the right hand seem to naturally lend themselves to starting on the upper note and incorporating afternotes, aligning with earlier performance practices. You might logically assume that the trills in the subsequent minuet and final movement would be treated similarly. However, there is a very strong performance tradition of starting these particular trills on the main note, even though it can present more technical challenges for the performer.
Interesting.
Interestingly, the majority of editors, both in the 19th and 20th centuries, actually advocate for this later practice. This highlights how performance tradition can sometimes become the dominant force in interpretation.
So tradition can sometimes override what might seem historically consistent.
It appears so. A particularly intriguing example arises in the final movement of the Waldstein Sonata, Opus 53. Here, the right hand is required to play double notes while simultaneously sustaining a trill.
Oh, tricky.
Very. If the trill is started on the upper note, it creates intervals of sevenths and seconds at certain points, which can sound quite dissonant. However, if the trill is started on the main note, it results in consonant intervals, octaves, and a unison, and a more manageable coordination for the pianist.
Okay, that makes more sense physically.
Editors have been quite divided on how to resolve this. Some attempt to adhere to Beethoven's written-out realization, but suggest altering the dissonant second to a unison for smoother execution. Others propose interrupting the trill briefly when the melodic notes occur. This is sometimes referred to as a false trill.
A false trill.
Yeah. A few editors even admit they are unsure of Beethoven's exact intention and simply adjust the trill to create more conventional and consonant intervals, citing both musical and technical considerations.
That sounds like a real puzzle where even the experts have different theories. What about the presence of grace notes immediately before a trill? Do they offer any clues about whether to start on the main or upper note?
That's a very insightful point.
Yeah.
Consider the first movement of the Appassionata Sonata, Opus 57. Some of the trills are preceded by a grace note, while others are not.
Aha.
The autograph manuscript and the first printed edition are consistent in this detail, making it unlikely to be a mere oversight. Some editors interpret the presence of the grace note as Beethoven's indication that the trill should begin on the main note, reflecting the evolving performance practices of his time.
Okay.
Others interpret the grace note as a separate short note to be played just before the main beat, distinct from the trill itself.
So a tiny little grace note can unlock a whole range of interpretive possibilities.
Absolutely. In Opus 57, measure 3, the grace note could be played very quickly before the beat, with the trill starting on the beat itself. Alternatively, it could be incorporated into the trill, played on the beat as the first note of the trill. The 3/16 notes that follow in that measure could be played with a precise rhythmic value, making them sound slower than the rapid oscillations of the trill, or they could be treated as afternotes to the trill, played at the same speed.
Wow. Lots of options.
Then, if you look at measure 11, where there is no preceding grace note, many interpreters take that as a deliberate indication to start the trill on the upper auxiliary note, suggesting Beethoven intended a different approach in these two seemingly similar passages.
It's like a subtle language within the music that performers have to learn to understand. What about the ending of trills? Should they always conclude with a little turn-like figure, those afternotes we mentioned?
The question of whether to add afternotes, sometimes called Nachschlag in German, is equally complex. When Beethoven explicitly wrote them out in the score, as he sometimes did, then they should certainly be played.
Okay, that's clear.
The ambiguity arises when they are not indicated. If we return to Opus 2, number 1, the trills in the first and third movements do have afternotes notated, but none of the trills in the fourth movement do. Many editors believe this omission in the final movement is simply an oversight by Beethoven or the engraver and suggest adding them for the sake of consistency. However, another argument could be made that their absence in the fast, energetic prestissimo tempo of the last movement was intentional,
Ah, practicality.
as omitting them would make the trills easier to execute cleanly at that speed. Inconsistencies can even be found within single movements, such as in the fugue of the Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106, where editors disagree on whether to add afternotes to trills that are not explicitly notated with them.
So it's a balancing act between striving for consistency, considering the practicalities of performance, and trying to discern the composer's likely intent.
Precisely. There are also fascinating instances where the trill itself seems to involve a deliberate change in tempo. In the final variation of Opus 109, the underlying pulse of the music remains steady, but the speed of the trill gradually increases, creating a sense of excitement.
Oh, cool effect.
Beethoven actually wrote out the individual notes of the trill for quite a while before indicating the final acceleration with shorter note values. Another example is in the slow introduction to Opus 111, where a trill extends right through a change in tempo marking.
Right through it.
Yeah. Editors have offered widely varying interpretations of how to perform this, ranging from different ways of creating a smooth acceleration, to simply playing the entire introduction at a tempo fast enough that the different written note values effectively become equal in duration.
It sounds like Beethoven was really pushing the expressive possibilities of even a seemingly simple ornament, like a trill. Let's move on to turns, that little squiggly line you sometimes see above or between notes. What are the key performance practice considerations for realizing those?
The use of the turn symbol actually became less and less frequent over the course of Beethoven's sonata output. The earlier sonatas are full of them.
Yeah.
The second movement of Opus 2, number 1 for instance, contains no fewer than 15.
15. Wow.
But you won't find any turn symbols in the final 4 piano sonatas. Their last appearance is in the first movement of Opus 101.
Interesting trend.
Interestingly, in that same Opus 101, you can observe Beethoven increasingly choosing to write out the turn gesture in full notation, rather than relying on the more ambiguous symbol. This trend towards more explicit notation provides much clearer guidance for the performer.
So when Beethoven writes out the turn, it gives us a much more precise understanding of his intended execution.
Exactly. Turn symbols also appear written directly over a note, rather than placed between two notes. There tends to be even less agreement among editors on how to realize these, and the specific musical context often plays a crucial role in determining the most appropriate execution.
Okay.
If you examine the two examples in the second movement of Opus 2, number 1, you'll notice that the notation of the turn symbol is slightly different in each instance.
Subtle differences.
Yeah. Some editors interpret this subtle visual distinction as an indication that the turn in the first occurrence should begin on the upper auxiliary note, while the turn in the seventh measure should start on the main note.
Subtle visual cues in the notation leading to different musical outcomes.
Precisely. When the turn symbol is placed over a note that is a lower neighbor to the preceding note, there is a fairly well-established practice of beginning the turn on the main note, especially if the tempo is quick and there isn't much time to execute the ornament.
Makes sense.
Earlier performance practice generally favored playing turns directly on the beat. However, there's a very strong tradition, dating back to the writings of Czerny around 1839, of performing the turn as 3 quick grace notes played just before the main beat.
Before the beat. Okay.
This pre-beat realization is often recommended by editors as a practical and stylistically appropriate solution.
So the rhythmic placement of the little turn often gets adjusted depending on the historical period of performance practice.
It does. However, it's also possible that when Beethoven intended a departure from these generally accepted realizations, he would employ a more precise and detailed notation in the score.
Right.
There are instances where some editors have actually disregarded Beethoven's specific notation of a turn, directing the performer to play the grace notes on the beat, according to the earlier practice. In these situations, the performer faces a choice between strictly adhering to the composer's notated wishes and opting for a more conventional and perhaps easier to execute realization.
And Beethoven wasn't afraid to combine these ornamental figures, was he? The trilled turn sounds like a particularly intricate embellishment.
Yes, he utilized a combination of the turn and mordant symbols, what C.P.E. Bach in his treatise referred to as a trilled turn. We encounter this combined ornament in the first movements of both Opus 54 and Opus 78. Bach even provided a specific and somewhat elaborate realization of this ornament in his writings. However, in Opus 54, Beethoven's use of short trill signs in musically similar passages has led many editors to shy away from Bach's complex realization and instead suggest simpler, more conventional turns.
Simplification.
In Opus 78, the rapid tempo of the first movement also tends to obscure the rhythmic intricacies of Bach's realization, so most editors recommend a simple turn starting on the main note, although there is still debate about its exact rhythmic execution. This shows how practical considerations like tempo can influence editorial decisions about ornamentation.
So sometimes the composer's potentially complex intention gets simplified in practice for musical clarity or ease of execution. Let's briefly touch on accicatures and short appoggiatures, those small grace notes that often appear just before a main note. What are the key performance considerations for these?
A common modern performance practice, particularly for descending grace notes, is to play them on the beat and to give them roughly equal rhythmic value, often taking up one of 4 equal subdivisions of that beat.
Okay, on the beat.
A good example of this can be heard in the second movement of the Pathetique Sonata, Opus 13. Some believe this tradition developed because this descending 8th note figure in the grace notes is related to the main theme of the movement, where the four notes are written as equal quarter notes.
Ah, a thematic connection.
Regardless of the precise historical origin of this practice, this way of realizing these short grace notes as integral parts of the beat has become quite established in classical piano performance, and it's frequently applied even to earlier music by other composers. It provides a sense of rhythmic integration and clarity.
Okay, a fairly consistent approach for those fleeting little notes that add a bit of a crushed sound. Now, let's move on to a topic that Beethoven really began to explore as the piano evolved: the use of the pedals. When did he start including pedal markings in his sonatas, and what are some of the interesting challenges they present?
The first instance of explicit pedal markings in Beethoven's piano sonatas appears in Opus 26. There, the pedal is used primarily at the ends of movements and in the trio section of the funeral march to reinforce the fundamental tonic harmony without creating a blurring effect across different harmonies.
So, pretty straightforward use initially.
Yeah. However, Opus 27, number 2, the Moonlight Sonata, presents a much more complex and debated situation right from the very beginning. Beethoven gives two sets of directions in the first movement, insisting that the dampers should remain continuously raised throughout the entire movement, sempre tenuto senza sordini.
Hold the pedal down the whole time.
Exactly. If this instruction is followed literally on a modern piano, it would result in a significant and likely overwhelming blurring of harmonies that would probably sound quite dissonant and muddy to our ears today.
Yeah, I bet.
Even Carl Czerny, who was Beethoven's own student and a highly respected pianist and teacher, advised in his writings that the pedal should be changed with each new bass note in this movement to maintain a degree of harmonic clarity.
So, Beethoven's seemingly direct instruction goes against even his students' understanding of good pedaling and musical clarity.
It does,
Yeah.
which suggests that Beethoven must have been aiming for a specific and perhaps unconventional sonic effect. Many believe that he intended to create a kind of ethereal, atmospheric haze with these sustained pedal instructions.
An atmospheric effect, okay.
This idea is supported by pedal markings in other Beethoven piano music, where he does intentionally mix harmonies, often sustaining both tonic and dominant chords simultaneously, or deliberately blurring melodic lines to achieve a particular color.
Right.
The recitative-like sections in the first movement recapitulation of Opus 31, number 2, are another compelling example where melodic lines containing several stepwise intervals are specifically marked to be played with sustained pedal.
Sustained pedal over stepwise motion?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Czerny himself described the effect here, noting that the pedal should be held for the entire length of each recitative passage, creating the impression of one complaining at a distance. These examples indicate Beethoven's willingness to use the pedal for expressive color, rather than just harmonic support.
It sounds like Beethoven was experimenting with the expressive possibilities of the pedal in a very innovative and forward-thinking way, even if it challenged the conventional understanding of its use.
Absolutely. The rondo movement of Opus 53, the Waldstein Sonata, contains pedal markings that sustain both tonic and dominant pedal points simultaneously through melodic and accompaniment figures that actually mix these two fundamental harmonies.
Mixing tonic and dominant with the pedal. Wow.
Even though some pianos of the time, including Beethoven's Broadwood, were equipped with a split damper pedal, it wouldn't have been particularly effective in this specific passage due to the register in which the upper register figuration is written. And the Erard piano that Beethoven was using around the time he composed Opus 53 didn't even have a split damper pedal. This further suggests that Beethoven's pedal markings were not always about achieving clarity in the traditional sense. They were often intended to create a specific sonic texture.
So Beethoven's pedaling wasn't solely about harmonic definition. It could be a tool for creating a desired soundscape or atmosphere. What about the una corda pedal, the soft pedal on the piano? Did Beethoven indicate its use to achieve particular timbral effects?
There is evidence to suggest that Beethoven was indeed very sensitive to the subtle change in timbre produced by the unicorda pedal, not just the reduction in volume.
More than just quieter.
Yeah, exactly. At the very end of the slow movement of Opus 106, the Hammerklavier Sonata, for instance, the dynamic marking decreases from pianissimo to a triple pianissimo at precisely the same moment as the una corda pedal is released for the final chord.
Simultaneous markings.
Some interpreters believe this indicates Beethoven's desire for a change in the actual color of that final chord, in addition to its extreme quietness. Others speculate that releasing the una corda was intended to prepare the sonic texture for the powerful and contrasting next movement.
Interesting theories.
We see another interesting example in Opus 110, where Beethoven marked both the engagement of the unicorda pedal and a subsequent crescendo and diminuendo while the pedal is still depressed, highlighting his awareness of the dynamic shading possible with his pedal.
Uh-huh.
Czerny, in his instructional writings, cautioned against overusing the unicorda, recommending it only for when another species of tone was specifically desired. He even suggested its use in the final movement of Opus 7 at a sudden and unexpected modulation, again emphasizing its potential for creating a distinct change in tonal color.
So, the unicorda pedal in Beethoven's hands was more than just a volume control. It was a tool for subtle tonal shifts and expressive coloring. Let's move on to articulation, the slurs and staccato markings in the score. These can really shape the phrasing and character of a music. What are some important considerations for interpreting Beethoven's articulation?
Understanding the natural contours of the hand on the keyboard can often provide valuable insight into Beethoven's slurring. In the second movement of Opus 13, the Pathetic Sonata, for example, the slurs frequently group notes that would fall quite naturally under a single-hand position,
Ah, pianistic writing.
suggesting that the composer not only heard these groupings, but also conceived them pianistically. However, some of Beethoven's slurs that might initially appear awkward or counterintuitive actually require a deeper understanding of the underlying musical phrasing.
Okay.
In the opening of the third movement of the Pathétique, for instance, the seemingly long slur that extends across the bar line makes a great deal of musical sense when you consider the symmetrical relationship between the two opening phrases.
Symmetry.
The articulation pattern that Beethoven specifically marked reinforces the idea of a strong downbeat at the beginning of each phrase, even as the slur connects the notes across the bar.
So the slurs aren't always just about creating a smooth legato. They can also be structural indicators, delineating the musical architecture. What about the difference between staccato dots and wedges in Beethoven's autograph manuscripts and early printed publications? Is there a clear distinction in their intended meaning?
That's a notoriously tricky area for performers and editors. One might logically assume that staccato dots and staccato wedges would indicate different degrees or types of detached articulation, with wedges perhaps suggesting a shorter, more accented, and more forceful staccato than dots.
Seems logical, yeah.
However, when you closely examine Beethoven's original handwritten scores and the early printed editions of his music, you often find these symbols used in a rather inconsistent manner, appearing in a variety of random shapes and thicknesses.
Oh, inconsistent.
This lack of uniformity makes it virtually impossible to establish definitive rules for distinguishing between the intended meaning of a dot versus a wedge in Beethoven's notation.
So rather than relying on a strict visual distinction between dots and wedges, performers have to look at the broader musical context to infer the intended type of detached articulation. Finally, let's delve into the realm of tempo and tempo fluctuations in Beethoven's music. He famously provided metronome markings for many of his works, but how strictly should these be adhered to, and what about the idea of making tempo changes within individual movements?
This is a perennial and often passionate debate in the world of Beethoven performance. It's crucial to first distinguish between rubato, which involves subtle and expressive fluctuations of tempo within a short musical phrase or segment,
Right, small-scale changes.
and larger, more structural tempo shifts that reflect the overall emotional arc and character of the music. While we readily accept and even expect these larger tempo adjustments in the music of later 19th century composers like Chopin and Schumann, the question arises as to whether this kind of performance practice was already prevalent during Beethoven's lifetime, and if so, to what extent he might have anticipated or condoned it in his piano music.
We touched earlier on Arthur Schnabel's edition, which explicitly suggested tempo changes within movements. What has been the general view among musicians and scholars on this topic?
There has been no real consensus, and opinions vary widely. As we discussed, Schnabel was quite explicit in indicating tempo modifications in his edition. Conversely, influential conductors like Arturo Toscanini famously championed the idea of striving for a relatively unified and consistent tempo throughout a movement in classical music, emphasizing the importance of structural integrity and a clear sense of forward momentum.
Two very different schools of thought.
Indeed. In some instances, a strong performance tradition has developed around making a specific tempo adjustment in a particular passage. For example, most performers tend to slightly broaden the tempo for the more lyrical and expressive second theme in the first movement of the Waldstein Sonata, Opus 53,
Right, the famous second theme.
in contrast to the more energetic and driving tempo of the opening material. Ultimately, Each performer must make their own informed decision about whether making tempo adjustments within movements feels stylistically appropriate in Beethoven's music, and if so, in which movements and to what degree of flexibility to allow. It's a deeply personal artistic choice informed by historical awareness and musical intuition.
It really underscores the idea that performing Beethoven is an ongoing act of interpretation rather than just mechanical reproduction.
Precisely. Now, stepping back for a moment from these very detailed considerations of performance practice, it's impossible to discuss Beethoven's piano sonatas without acknowledging the sheer and overwhelming expressive power that permeates this entire body of work.
Absolutely.
His music evokes such a profound range of universal human emotions and concepts, from the heroic and triumphant to the deeply tragic and introspective, from moments of playful humor and lightness to passages of profound philosophical contemplation.
It's that ineffable quality, that ability to speak directly to the human experience, that keeps us returning to his music generation after generation.
Exactly. Trying to fully articulate precisely why his music has such a powerful impact is often elusive. Why is his use of what was essentially a common harmonic language so often capable of conveying depths of emotion that surpass many of his contemporaries?
Yeah, how does he do that?
What is it about his slow movements that can transport us to such a deeply reflective space? These are the kinds of questions that often resist easy or definitive answers. However, when we delve into specific examples within the piano sonatas, we can begin to glimpse some of the techniques he masterfully employed.
Okay.
His use of extreme registers on the piano can often suggest the timbres of other instruments, perhaps the soaring quality of a flute in the high register or the percussive role of timpani in the low.
Instrumental suggestion.
He was a master of dynamic contrast, often employing sudden and dramatic shifts in volume to create moments of intense drama and to delineate the structural contours of his music. And his accentuation, frequently appearing in unexpected places on weaker beats, adds a unique rhythmic drive, tension, and expressive emphasis.
He certainly wasn't afraid to challenge the listener's expectations and create moments of surprise.
Not at all. And extending beyond these moment-to-moment expressive details, Beethoven was also a profound structural innovator. He increasingly imbued the final movements of his sonatas with significant weight and importance, sometimes making them the emotional and intellectual culmination of the entire work.
Giving the finale more weight.
Yeah. He frequently altered the return of the first theme in the recapitulation section of sonata form in surprising and transformative ways, changing its dynamics, its register on the piano, or its textural deployment to heighten its impact and offer new perspectives on the initial material. And he wasn't hesitant to begin movements on harmonies other than the tonic, creating a sense of yearning, instability, or dramatic anticipation right from the very outset.
Starting off balance.
He also masterfully employed what has been referred to as a turnaround in the recapitulation, where he would briefly venture into unexpected key areas after the initial statement of the first theme before ultimately returning to the home key.
Taking little detours.
And he often introduced surprising structural or harmonic twists and turns right at the very close of movements, almost like a final thought-provoking gesture.
So whether it was in the minute details of articulation or the grand sweep of the sonata form, Beethoven was constantly exploring new possibilities.
He was. And when you listen closely and study these works, you can even begin to discern potential connections and recurring patterns in his creative thinking across different sonatas.
Oh, like hidden links.
Kind of. The reappearance of certain key relationships between movements, such as those involving mediant or submediant intervals, is a striking feature in many of his sonatas and suggests a deeper level of interconnectedness.
Interesting.
You can also find instances of shared melodic contours, rhythmic figures, or harmonic progressions, subtly linking different movements within a single sonata, almost like a hidden thread weaving them together.
Wow.
And then, of course, there are those utterly unique and unforgettable moments that define individual sonatas, the dramatic and unsettling dynamic contrast at the very opening of Opus 2, number 1.
Right, that stark opening.
The surprising and unexpected ending of Opus 10, number 1, which concludes in the parallel major key, the extended and dramatically charged coda of the Moonlight Sonata, the significant rewriting of the recapitulation in Opus 31, number 2.
The Tempest.
The exhilarating and virtuosic transition in the Waldstein, the lighter and more songful character of the Opus 79 Sonata, the clear programmatic elements of the Liebewohl Sonata, Opus 81A.
The Farewell.
The use of a German tempo marking in Opus 90, the monumental and demanding fugue that forms the final movement of the Hammerklavier, the sudden and surprising diminished seventh chord that opens the adagio of Opus 109.
Beautiful moment.
The improvisatory and almost fantasia-like sections in Opus 110, or the unsettling and ambiguous opening diminished seventh chord of Opus 111. These are just a few glimpses into what one author aptly described as the windmills of Beethoven's mind.
It truly feels like each of these 32 sonatas is its own self-contained and richly detailed universe, yet they all bear the unmistakable and powerful stamp of Beethoven's singular genius.
Exactly. So as you could hear, performing Beethoven's piano sonatas is far more than simply playing the notes printed on the page. It is an ongoing journey of discovery and a constant process of informed decision-making,
Yeah.
continually shaped by historical sources, the insights of generations of editors and performers, and ultimately by the individual performer's own deeply considered musical convictions and understanding.
And it sounds like definitive answers to many of these questions remain elusive.
Precisely. Many of these performance practice considerations remain open to interpretation and lively debate. And that is, in many ways, part of what makes this music so endlessly fascinating and rewarding to engage with.
Right.
It compels us to listen more attentively, to think more critically, and to appreciate the nuanced and constantly evolving understanding we have of Beethoven's enduring artistic vision.
So as our listener continues their own exploration of these incredible and multifaceted works, what's one final thought you'd like to leave them with?
Well, maybe consider how these inherent challenges we've discussed today, these discrepancies in the original sources, these intriguing questions of ornamentation and articulation, these diverse possibilities for pedaling and tempo interpretation, how all of these contribute to the enduring power and profound relevance of Beethoven's piano sonatas for both those who dedicate themselves to performing them and those who find solace and inspiration in listening.
That's a great point.
Perhaps approaching this music with a renewed awareness of these inherent complexities will unlock an even deeper and more personal appreciation for this monumental and inexhaustible body of work.